The scene is a smoke-filled back room in Munich, 1918. We see maps of the Arctic Circle spread across a heavy oak table, marked with strange, runic symbols. The camera focuses on the faces of the men, gathered their expressions a mixture of academic intensity and fanatical belief. The narrator describes the sensory details: the smell of old paper and cold cigar smoke, the low murmur of voices discussing a homeland lost to ice and time. This wasn't a historical society. This was the Thule Society, an occultist group searching for the mythical origin of the Aryan race. The narrator explains that from this room, a direct line can be drawn to the greatest horrors of the 20th century. The story isn't about finding a lost continent. It's about uncovering how a beautiful ancient dream was meticulously twisted into a blueprint for a nightmare. And now, please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. That dark obsession, that twisting of a myth into a weapon, didn't begin in a German beer hall. To understand the sickness, you first have to understand the perfect, pristine dream it infected. We have to travel back 2,500 years to a world that smelled of olive groves and salt sea, to the very first whispers of a place called Hyperborea. The earliest accounts don't come from wild-eyed mystics. They come from the most credible sources of the age. We have the meticulous notes of the historian Herodotus, a man who dealt in facts. He never saw Hyperborea, but he found its fingerprints. He documented a strange ritual: sacred offerings, carefully wrapped in wheat straw, that would appear in Scythia as if from nowhere. He then traced their path, a forensic chain of custody that snaked across the continent, from tribe to tribe, all the way to the sacred island of Delos. He even gives us names: Hyperoch and Laodice, the first emissaries from this ghost country. This wasn't just a fairy tale, it was a connection, a tangible, physical link to an impossible source. But if Herodotus gave us the cold facts, the poet Pindar gave us the sensory reality. Can you imagine it? A land where the air is filled not with cries of pain, but with the constant ringing of lyres and flutes. A people who wreathe their hair not in funeral shrouds, but in golden laurel. And here is the most disturbing detail, the one that violates every law of biology. Pindar tells us they know neither disease nor bitter old age. This isn't a culture. It's a perfect biological specimen, a race exempt from suffering, a living, breathing utopia. A story this perfect is seductive, but it was only half of the legend. Because while poets dreamed of a perfect people, a real explorer, a man of flesh and blood, was sailing into the freezing northern fog to find a very real place. And what he documented was far stranger and far more tangible than a land without death. While poets dreamed of a perfect people, a real explorer, a man of flesh and blood, was sailing into the freezing northern fog to find a very real place. His name was Pytheas of Massalia. He wasn't a mystic, he was a navigator, a scientist from the Greek colony of Marseille, and around 325 BCE, he pointed his ship north and sailed off the edge of the known world. What he brought back wasn't a poem. It was a logbook, a collection of cold, hard, forensic data. He gave a precise location for a land he called Thule, 6 days' sail north of Britain. He made a specific astronomical observation, a detail that could be tested. In Thule, during the summer solstice, the sun barely set. Think about that. In an age of myth, this is a verifiable scientific fact about the Arctic Circle, a detail that proves he was exactly where he claimed to be. This wasn't a guess, it was a measurement. And it's that scientific credibility that makes his next observation so terrifying. Because as he pushed further north, the world began to break down. The laws of physics started to fray. He wrote of a place where the sea, the air, and the land were no longer separate things. He described a substance he called the pneumon thalatios, the sea lung. Imagine it. Your boat is no longer cutting through water, but pushing through a thick, viscous, gelatinous slush. The waves die. The air grows heavy. The world becomes a single quivering membrane where you can neither walk nor sail. It's a description of something utterly alien, a physical barrier at the end of the world. He had returned with precise data, a verifiable astronomical reading, and a description of a physical phenomenon that defied all explanation. He had brought back proof, but in the ancient world, when you return from the edge of the map with a story that breaks the laws of nature, you are not always met with praise. Sometimes you are met with an accusation, a single word that will attempt to bury your discovery for 2,000 years. That word was liar. And the man who wielded it like a weapon was not some minor rival, but the most respected geographer of the Roman world. Strabo. 300 years after Pytheas returned, Strabo sat down to write his definitive Geographica, the official map of reality for the entire empire. And when he came to the story of Thule, his judgment was swift and absolute. He branded Pytheas an arch liar, the worst kind of fabricator. You have to understand, for a man like Strabo, the world had rules. It had a known freezing limit. He had the reports from Roman governors in Britain. He knew of the miserable cold, the constant rain, the tribes huddled in the damp fog at the very edge of civilization. His logic was brutal and simple. If Britain is barely habitable, then a land 6 days' sail further north would be an impossible, uninhabitable wasteland of ice. It simply could not exist. To Strabo, Pytheas wasn't just wrong. He was a fraud who was violating the fundamental, established laws of nature and geography. It was the word of a lone explorer with a fantastic tale versus the entire weight of academic authority. And authority won. Strabo's verdict became history. Pytheas's journey was officially erased, relegated to the category of a sailor's ghost story, a cautionary tale about a liar. And so, the file was closed. Thule was buried for nearly 2,000 years under the weight of this single damning judgment. But a story this powerful, a whisper of a world beyond our own, never truly dies. It just goes dormant, waiting for a new kind of believer. A believer who wasn't looking for a new land to map, but for a new history to invent. And in doing so, would transform a simple explorer's tale into something truly monstrous. For 2,000 years, the story lay dormant, a geographical debate locked away in dusty texts. But the transformation from a historical mystery into a monstrous horror story required an architect, and in the late 19th century, the world found one in a shadowy and charismatic Russian mystic named Helena Blavatsky. In 1888, she unleashed her magnum opus, a colossal work of occult cosmology called The Secret Doctrine. And inside its pages, she took the classical sunlit dream of Hyperborea and dragged it into a lightless abyss. Forget the golden laurels and the ringing lyres. Blavatsky's Hyperboreans were not noble ancestors. She called them the second root race, and they were a physiological nightmare. This is no longer a utopian dream. It's a detailed description of a monster. She describes them as giants, some reaching 18 feet tall, but with soft, pliable, gelatinous bodies. Picture that. Towering, boneless figures. She claimed they were mindless, guided only by instinct, possessing 4 arms. And then comes the final detail, a piece of pure biological horror. They had a third eye, not in their forehead, but in the back of their head, a vestigial organ that allowed them to see without physical sight. The beautiful, perfected race of Greek poetry had been twisted into a grotesque, inhuman entity. You might think this is just a strange, harmless fantasy, but it wasn't. It was a doctrine. It was a new, secret history of humanity being presented as fact. Blavatsky had created the monsters. She had twisted the beautiful myth into a grotesque lineage, but a monster is just a story until someone decides to claim it as their ancestor. And in the chaos of post-war Germany, a group of men were about to do just that, taking her nightmare vision and forging it into a weapon of terrifying power. Blavatsky's monstrous vision was an ideological powder keg waiting for a spark. And that spark came here, in the bitter, chaotic streets of Munich in 1918. Germany had lost the war. The country was broken, humiliated, and desperate for a story that could explain their defeat and promise a glorious future. It was the perfect breeding ground for a new kind of myth, and in August of that year, a man named Rudolf von Sabottendorf founded a secret society to provide one. The Thule Society. Their belief system was a toxic cocktail of occultism, nationalism, and violent anti-Semitism, and at its heart was a single explosive idea, that the Aryan race was not descended from apes, but from a race of superhumans who had survived the destruction of their northern homeland, a lost continent they called Ultima Thule. This wasn't just a discussion group, this was a political machine in the making. They bought their own newspaper, the Münchener Beobachter, to spread their ideology of racial purity. They stockpiled weapons. They drew up lists of political enemies. And, most importantly, they began to sponsor a tiny, insignificant political group that shared their violent, nationalistic views. The German Workers' Party. This is the forensic link, the moment the phantom story becomes a physical threat. They took an ancient geographical mystery, filtered it through a grotesque occult lens, and handed it, fully weaponized, to an angry young corporal who had recently joined the party's ranks. That party would soon change its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. The myth was no longer a secret whispered in a back room. It was about to become state policy. And the hunt for a phantom homeland was about to fuel a very real and very global nightmare. Once the Nazi Party seized power, the search for Thule was no longer a backroom hobby for occultists. It became a state-sanctioned obsession, fueled by the vast resources of the Reich and driven by the fanatical conviction of one man in particular, Heinrich Himmler. As head of the SS, Himmler was the high priest of this new, twisted religion. For him, Thule was not just a myth, it was a sacred fact, the lost Eden of the master race. And to prove it, he created one of the strangest and most sinister organizations in history, the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Society. This was the SS's very own academic wing, a bizarre parody of a university tasked with finding scientific proof for a racial fantasy. Imagine teams of SS-backed scientists spreading across the globe, from the ice caves of Iceland to the mountains of Tibet, carrying calipers to measure the skulls of living people, desperate to find a physical trace of their phantom ancestors. They weren't just digging for artifacts. They were searching for racial validation, and this is where the story turns from a disturbing delusion into an accessory to mass murder. You see, to justify annihilating millions of people deemed racially impure, you must first create a story of your own divine, pure origin. The hunt for Thule wasn't a distraction from the Holocaust. It was its mythological foundation. Every skull measured, every ancient rune studied, was another brick in the ideological wall that separated the master race from those they were sending to the gas chambers. They spent millions, sent expeditions across the world, and built a genocidal ideology on a foundation of pure fantasy. But all that time, the original witness report from 2,000 years earlier sat buried in the archives, holding a verifiable scientific clue. The question is, what does modern science, free from the poison of ideology, have to say about the strange, impossible things Pytheas actually saw? After a journey through 2,000 years of myth-making and ideological horror, it's time to return to the scene of the crime, to the original logbook, to the testimony of the one man who actually went there. When modern oceanographers, historians, and climatologists re-examine the words of Pytheas, free from ancient prejudice or modern ideology, the arch-liar suddenly starts to look like a meticulous scientific observer. Let's look at his most fantastic claim, the sea lung. That viscous, gelatinous substance where sea and air bleed together. To a Greek sailor who had only ever seen the warm Mediterranean, it would have seemed like a violation of physics. But to a modern Arctic scientist, it sounds familiar. It sounds like a remarkably precise, non-scientific description of a known phenomenon. They call it grease ice or pancake ice. Imagine it. At the edge of the polar pack, the sea surface doesn't just freeze solid. It turns into a thick, soupy slush that deadens the waves, making rowing feel like you're pulling through wet cement. Disks of newly formed ice, like giant lily pads, knock against the hull. The air, thick with freezing fog, seems to merge with the sea. What Pytheas described wasn't a monster, it was the birth of an ice pack. And once you accept that, the rest of his journey snaps into focus. His 6-day sail from Britain, his observation of the midnight sun, it all points to a real, verifiable location. Modern scholars have plotted the course. His Thule was likely the coast of Norway, or perhaps Iceland. The journey was real. The place was real. The impossible phenomenon he described was real. So, the science is clear. Pytheas was not a liar. He was a pioneer, which leads to the most profound question of all. If the truth was there all along, buried in the data, why did the world, for centuries, prefer the monstrous fantasy? Why do we so often choose a beautiful or terrifying lie over a complicated truth? The answer has nothing to do with maps or ice packs. It has everything to do with us. This whole story, this 2,000-year-long obsession, was never really about geography. It was always about psychology. The search for a place like Hyperborea or Thule is a symptom of a deep and profoundly human vulnerability. Think about it. Almost every culture has a version of this story. A Garden of Eden. A golden age of heroes. A time before the world broke. We seem to have a fundamental need to believe that our suffering, our conflicts, our imperfections are not the natural state of things, but a corruption of some lost, perfect original. A blank space on the map like Thule is the perfect screen onto which we can project that longing. It's an answer to an existential ache. The promise of Thule is the promise that we are not just animals who evolved from the mud. It's the promise that we are the demigods who fell from a northern paradise. For a person, or a nation, feeling broken and humiliated, that is not just a story. It is the most powerful drug in the world. It tells you that your current suffering is not your fault, and that your true nature is one of forgotten greatness. This deep-seated need for a perfect past is the true lost continent. It's a permanent feature of our psychological landscape, and it leaves a door wide open for those who know how to exploit it. The story of Thule is a brutal case study in how that exploitation works. A warning that the most dangerous myths aren't about places we might find on a map, but about the stories we desperately want to believe about ourselves. So, where does this leave us? We followed a single story from a beautiful Greek dream of a sunlit paradise into the smoke and ash of a concentration camp. We watched it transform from a simple poem about a perfect people into a debated explorer's tale of a real place. We saw it twisted into a grotesque horror story of boneless, monstrous ancestors, and then forged into the ideological core of the most destructive regime in human history. The journey of this myth is a journey into the darkest parts of our own nature. And this forces us to ask a final, uncomfortable question. Look around you now. How often do we still see this same pattern? How many modern ideologies, promising a return to a lost greatness or a pure forgotten origin, are just new names for an old phantom homeland? How often is the story of a perfect, mythical past used to justify a brutal, exclusionary present? The ultimate lesson of Thule is that the most dangerous territory is not on any map. The true lost land is not at the North Pole. It is the territory of human reason, a landscape that can be conquered and occupied by a powerful enough story, and once it's taken, the real-world consequences are written in blood.